Welcome everyone to the Lifebulb webinar series focused on solid organ transplantation. We want to thank the Loxis Pharmaceuticals for sponsoring this educational series, where we're going to take you through the supportive care measures that are so important to achieve a successful transplant, but then also maintain good quality of life post-transplant. My name is Karin Hamburger. I'm the president of Lifebulb. I have a background as a medical doctor and a scientist, but importantly for this context, I'm also a three-time organ transplant recipient, most recently a kidney, a little bit more than a year ago. And I'm really happy to be joined here today by Alisha, one of our community managers, but also, a strong advocate in the liver transplant community and really across all organ transplant. So welcome, Alisha. Why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. So as Karin mentioned, I'm Alisha. I'm a community manager here at Transplant Life. I'm also a two-time liver transplant recipient. I had back-to-back liver transplants in 2020. My first one was from my brother, my living donor, and then I was retransplanted 3 days later with a deceased donor. And I am really passionate about emotional well-being, mental health post-transplant. It was something I needed, and I found myself in search of these resources. And then I really created what I wanted to see, and I started gathering all those things together. I also teach yoga and body-based movement therapies, and then I am a mind-body somatic coach as well, working with grief specifically.
Thank you. And you really have dug deep into this subject. And at Lifebulb, we call it patient entrepreneurs. You've really addressed a need that you've identified, and now you're working in the space and you're combining your passions with your work and life in general. So that's congratulations. Yeah. It can sometimes be a little hard, I can imagine as well, because you're always thinking about these things and you are yourself a transplant recipient. What were some of the progression, immediately after transplant? Maybe there were really medical, crises in your case, especially because you had the 3-day interval and then you had another transplant. And how did your journey bring you to a point where you now can share with others versus, fighting for yourself?
Yeah, it is a long story. I went into transplant fully expecting I was going to have a living donor, and they said, okay, you'll be awake, the next day. And I was like, great, this is what we're going for, and it'll be wonderful. And that was not what happened at all. I woke up almost a month later from my transplant date to find out I had been given 2 transplants. And initially there was this huge period of what just happened to me, like disorientation. There's so much going on. Hospital is not a calm, soothing place to be to begin with. There's lights and noises and everything going on. So I was in an initial shock and not understanding what was happening. And I was just trying to keep my head above water with all the new medications. And they're like, now you're going to go to physiotherapy and now you're going to go here. And so it was survival mode for probably a good while, just as I was trying to wrap my head around everything that had just happened and everything that I knew was going to come. And there hit a point, I think a couple months in, where it all started to hit me of the surgeries that I'd had and everything that I'd been through. All this stuff started coming up of I'd been in the hospital and now there were memories that were associated with this. And now I was having to go back and I was having, anxiety in the waiting room. And I wasn't really sure what that meant or what that looked like. And I consider myself very fortunate that I did have this background in body-based therapy and emotional health going into it, because I kind of had a little bit of a framework for what was happening to me, and I could kind of pull at the pieces. And I realized pretty quickly that there was something else here, an emotional layer that I needed to sit with and process. So that's really what I did. It started as my own journey and kind of figuring out what I needed. And I happened to be a millennial that shared everything on the internet. So I realized as I was sharing, like, hey, this was really traumatic and that happened to me, other people were saying, oh yeah, me too. And I really started putting the pieces together. As I, figured out my own recovery and what that was going to look like for me, it became very natural that other people are dealing with this too. Other people are getting to a point where they're like, what just happened? And they don't have that level of support. So it felt really natural for me to take my personal background and the training that I'd had and bring them together and saying, let's give this back to the transplant community.
That's beautiful. So tell me, the transplant centers do a pretty extensive job to prepare patients for the surgery, right? For the stay in the hospital, for the normal course, which is around a week, right? And what are the drugs you're going to be on? What are the visits afterwards? What are some of the risks? And they focus on the risks that are medical, meaning infection, bleed, surgical complications, rejection, of course. But do you think they do a good job in preparing a patient for what you were talking about, meaning, I guess, grief, meaning a little bit PTSD, I think you were referring to, being back in the waiting room and reliving some of that time. Do you think they do that? Was that ever discussed with you ahead of this transplant?
It was discussed a little bit. Most of the emphasis was on, like you were saying, the drugs and the lifestyle change that I was going to be having. I had a couple of meetings with a social worker, and then I had a therapist through this whole process.
That
But it
was from the transplant center.
Yeah. So I was connected with a therapist. Yeah. And I don't know if that's something, I don't think anybody could have prepared me necessarily for that. It's kind of, you're thrown into the deep end.
Yeah.
And then you kind of got to figure it out on your own, is a lot of what I experienced. And it's also if we don't talk about it, maybe it's not going to happen.
Yeah. I guess that's always kind of a strategy, right? If we don't bring it up, maybe people won't think about it. The transplant psychologist, I guess, or therapist that you worked with, were you also offered other resources such as, peer, a buddy, or, someone that you could talk to who'd been through what you were about to go through?
Yeah. So I was connected once I was, awake and conscious and able to do things. They handed me this whole resource sheet. So there was peer support groups. They did connect me with a couple people who had gone through transplant that I talked to on the phone or that I connected with one-on-one. I would say that was my lifeline during those early days, because the doctors had all the knowledge and they were wonderful, but I wanted someone that had lived it. So having people that I could talk to that, like, hey, I remember what this was like for me. That honestly was the thing I think that got me through more than any of the professional help that they also offered me.
Do you remember any kind of little, tidbits or tips or, nuggets of wisdom that they shared that helped you, like a specific tool for getting through those moments? Or was it more just the discussion or knowing that you had a sounding board?
It was both. I was very interested in, hearing people's experiences after I'd been through it, because it felt so disorienting to me. But one of the things that I remember that I still use and tell people to this day is this idea of finding the little things, finding the beautiful things.
Yeah.
Because when you're in the hospital, there's so much chaos and so much going on, and you're in a heightened state all the time, that I was told, can you find something beautiful and just bring your attention to that thing and let that be where your attention is for the next 2 minutes, 5 minutes. And that was really what got me through. I would just sit. We had these paintings in my room, and I would sit and I would stare at them, and I would just be focusing on the beauty for 2 minutes, and nothing else existed. And then I would go back into the chaos of the medical world. And then I would go in again to the beautiful painting, and then I would come back out. And it was really that, like, moving back and forth with the pleasurable, wonderful sensations and things that I was experiencing, and the not great things of the medical environment that really helped me get through it.
And do you think that for different people that beauty could be music or it could be whatever is the outlet for the individual?
Yeah, whatever you resonate with, whatever you're gonna find, like, this makes me feel good, that is the thing.
When I went in, I brought a candle and I brought some pictures. And, when I started lighting my candle, of course, they came up and said, you cannot have a candle in the hospital. But so I kept the candle and I could smell it without, lighting it, because also the smells that can turn you off or on. I think that is something as well that is proven, with nausea, and if you can divert your thinking. I think that's really good advice, and not just trying to solve the problem that you're in, but take yourself out of the problem and find something totally different that is beautiful.
I felt like I was resourcing myself and giving myself, the strength and the encouragement that I needed, so I could go back in and deal with all the medical things. And I would go back and forth, but I really needed that. Let's build back into Alisha as a human and not just Alisha as a patient.
Right. That's also a good distinction, that you're more than a patient, but in the hospital you are a patient, and not everyone treats maybe the whole person, even though I think the best providers do take that into consideration. For quality of life now, I follow you on social media. I see you really do all these different things. It's really kind of a full life you're at least sharing. Is that now coming naturally, or is it still an effort? Like, is it still so that you have to say, okay, now I need to look at this beauty, or is it part of a routine?
It's more natural to me now because I've spent so long practicing it and
Yeah,
building these tools up. There are still times that I'm like, I know I'm going to the lab this morning and my emotions are going to be high, that I will intentionally say, okay, then this block of time, we're going to get home from the lab and then we're going to go intentionally, like put on a song and dance or, look at something or pet my dog. Or so I will have moments where I will intentionally do it, but it also just becomes natural because I've spent so long doing it that it's normal for me to kind of move in that direction and incorporate those things into my day anyway.
yeah. And when you take yourself out of your normal environment where those things are not, and I know when you traveled recently, I mean, did you kind of keep routines or did you find new routines?
I try to keep the same framework. So
Yeah,
every morning, I'm going to do something that's going to stimulate my brain and that's going to move my body. What those things are might change,
yeah.
but I'm going to keep the same kind of framework for them. So I do that as I travel and I'm in new spaces. I'll say, okay, every morning I'm going to do something. I'm going to move my body. And when I'm at home, that might be going to the gym. But when I'm traveling, that might be, I'm going to go for a walk and look at the neighborhood. So it's always the same context, but the activities are different.
This to me is so important. I mean, this framework that you have created for Alisha probably could, be very valuable for other patients, right? Because I think when you're coming out of it, as you said, it's chaotic. And
Mm-hmm.
you need to set something up. And if you have even like the beginning of a framework that you can edit to your own preferences, that is helpful. And I'm sure that's kind of how you counsel as a coach to try to build that up and give people, some sort of guidelines. It's not, good with too many rules, but if you have, a way to break up the ordinary, it is critical because otherwise, people will seek maybe things that aren't as productive,
Mm-hmm.
food, abuse or non-compliance, right? When you're starting to seek adrenaline kicks, there are many ways of trying to get out of that rut. And I think you're really focusing on the healthy ones.
Yeah, exactly. If coming out of it, like when I come out of the hospital, I know I'm going to be in this high stakes environment and I can plan for it. I can bring those things into my routine. I can, give myself that framework that I need. And then I'm less likely to fall into the things like binge eating or, I'm
Right.
going to scroll for 12 hours because I've set myself up in a way that I'm set up to succeed.
Mhm. That's really terrific. For anyone now who's going to transplant, where do you think they can find a mentor like you? How do they get through this? Because I think if you don't know what to ask, you might never get this, right? You might just be thrown into this chaos and not everyone is as resourceful. And you said earlier, you already had some of it because
Hmm.
you're trained. But if you're not, and you're not a millennial, you're not searching all over the internet, how do we bring this into the transplant centers? This would be a good kind of almost series to bring out to centers and teach.
Yeah.
So kind of a program.
Yeah, that is what I'm actually working on and like big vision goals. That's what I would love for there to be is people that are offering, holistic patient support, this mind body support to transplant centers. We're getting there, but it's a very slow process and getting transplant centers to also see the value in emotional and mental health is kind of
Yeah.
taking longer. I'm particularly biased towards transplant life and the stuff we offer here because I think the community that we've grown in our support groups and on our forum is I have not seen a community like that anywhere else. And I love the honest conversations that we get to have. So that would be my first, like, if you want to check out one resource, I would say come hang out with us in the transplant life support groups in the forum and get to know some of the people here because we all have very different experiences, but very profound insights.
I love that. I need to do a support group that you're running. I
Yeah.
really would like to. And I think there's a real role for this program. It's not, again, rules, it's just guidelines. It's guidelines connected with support from peers, that can be translated into transplant centers so that people don't have to feel alone. Because again, the concept of not being alone, that is transplant life. Having the training to get those pieces that you need to be resilient almost when it comes to those high stress situations. You need to have your resources with you and they need to be built up when you're facing challenges because otherwise it's very easy to break down.
Yeah. It's like your little resource muscle and you have to keep building into it and
Yeah.
give yourself the strength that you need to keep it going. Otherwise you're going to crack under the pressure and everything's going to crumble. So you really need to build your resources.
Yeah, love that. So Alisha, anything that you can say to our community for those who are now in the beginning or those who are, long term? What do you advise for them beyond joining Transplant Life and your support groups?
The first thing I tell anybody that I'm talking to is exactly what you're feeling is okay. And odds are somebody else has felt it too. If you're feeling grief, if you're feeling angry, even if you don't necessarily have language for that yet, but you're like, something is happening, that is completely normal. And that's kind of something that happens to all of us in different ways. And then whatever way that you can kind of plug in to have an outlet for that, expressing your emotions. I mean, I love movement and art and sensory things, but there are so many different ways to start building those resources. So yeah, what you're feeling is everybody's felt it. It's totally normal. It's perfectly, this is what is meant to happen, and build up those resources so you can get through the other side.
I love that. Thank you, Alisha. Really, I always learn from you, and I think everyone who's listening to this will as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now. Have a good day.